In this episode, Jim Semivan, Tom DeLonge, and Peter Levenda explore the origins and collaborative process behind the Sekret Machines nonfiction trilogy. They dive into the challenges of writing about UFOs in a rapidly changing landscape and the government's complex involvement in the phenomenon.
I am Jim Semivan, and welcome to episode 14 of TTS Talks. Today we have two very special guests, Tom DeLonge and Peter Levenda, who will be discussing their nonfiction trilogy, Sekret Machines, Gods, Man, and War. Now, as many of you are aware, the third book in this series, War, was recently published after a long wait by many fans of the series. And for those of you not familiar with TTS Talks, this is a podcast where we take a deep dive into the complexities of our mission here at To the Stars by bringing you one-on-one conversations with the various people who are helping us achieve our goals and give life to our projects here at To the Stars. Tom DeLonge, as many of you know, is a musician, writer, director, actor, businessman, entrepreneur, and chairman of the board of To the Stars, Inc. Tom has recently returned home for a hiatus from his wildly successful Blink-182 tour, and we welcome him back. And Peter Levenda has found the time in his own busy schedule to sit down with Tom and myself to discuss this much-awaited final book in the Sekret Machines trilogy. Peter Levenda is the co-author with Tom in the Sekret Machines trilogy. He's a well-known and highly regarded historian known for his extensive research in and knowledge of occultism and occult history. He has an MA in both religious studies and Asian studies and has penned many published works on esoteric subjects. Peter is best known for his book Unholy Alliance, a history of Nazi involvement with the occult, and the trilogy Sinister Forces, a grimoire of American political witchcraft, one of my favorites. Peter has also appeared in numerous television programs on the History Discovery channels as an expert on Nazi Germany, especially on the extreme religious and esoteric ideas that formed the Nazi worldview. Tom, Peter, once again, thank you so much for being here today. I'm Jim Semivan, a co-founder of TTS and the vice president of operations, and your host today. So, gentlemen, let's get right into the conversation as there is a lot to discuss. All right. Let's answer the most obvious and ask about question first. Why has War taken so long to get published? Was there a reason for the delay in the publication of this book? Tom, you want to go first? And Peter, do you have anything to add to what Tom says?
Yeah, well, I first foremost got to say that, myself being listed as a co-author is quite the stretch. I'm definitely a producerial kind of guy. I'm definitely the person that got in contact with Peter to come in and do these scholarly works. I want the readers to know that this is Peter's work, and he worked really fucking hard on all these books. But we are a team, but we operate as a team at To the Stars, and Jim, you did a lot of work with Peter on this. So I just wanted to put that out there so people don't think I'm the one that's coming off as smart as the guy that actually wrote this book. So with that out of the way, why did it take so long? Well, number one, even when a book is finished being written, it takes about a year for it to kind of get edited and then get produced and put it in inventory and ship it out and put it on sale and all that kind of stuff. But besides that, there's only a few of these we can do a year as a company because we are a small company, but we're doing a lot of different things. People already know that we did a deal with Legendary Film for the Sekret Machines fictional books. We kind of say loosely historical fiction books. And we didn't want to write the third Sekret Machines book or the third Gods, Man, and War book, which is a part of this kind of Sekret Machines franchise. We didn't want to put those out prematurely. But when it comes to the nonfiction books, there was so much movement with the U.S. government and with all the hearings that they had and all the people coming forward that we wanted to make sure that we were not only at the tip of the spear, but we weren't kind of like regurgitating anything that was old news. We wanted to make sure that this river was fluid and moving swiftly and quickly with things to catch the public up to speed in the appropriate way. And that's where I really hand it to you, Jim, on your guidance, as I call you the parental figure in the background, working with Peter, getting this thing in shape. You laugh at that, but I see you laughing on film. They can't see you because the podcast is, yeah, I see you. But it's true, and so I think just those are the logistical reasons, taking our time with it and so on. But also, I guess, Peter, you can probably talk about what it took to even put this together.
Well, yeah, part of the problem was that things were changing that rapidly. We came out with book one in 2016. So it's been almost 10 years. I mean, it's 8 years since the first book came out. And from 2016 until now, so much shit happened, right? You had 2017, so you had the New York Times article. You had the formation, really, of To the Stars, right? You had all this other stuff. Jim came on board around that time. I mean, all these things were going on. And then it was the Senate, it was Congress, it was this, it was that, it was the Tic Tac videos and everything. So when you're writing a book called War, it's about politics and it's about the military stuff. You just kept getting hit with this stuff. And you're saying to yourself, how do I bring this up to date? How do I come out with a book when the news cycle is so fast that it's going to overtake anything you might want to write? So you had to go back and kind of reimagine what this book would really be about, how it would discuss, the deeper aspects of the military-industrial complex, the deeper aspects of politics between countries, international affairs, their responses to the UFO phenomenon and all of that, and kind of give it more solid, ground so that anybody reading this from, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, is still going to find a lot of information in there that they wouldn't ordinarily come across, in the normal cycle of events, reading the newspapers or reading other people's UFO books, which concentrate on different areas. We're trying to give you like the 30,000-foot view of this. So even though new stuff is coming out at the Pentagon or in Congress or wherever, different guys coming out with their books, we're giving you this 30,000-foot view. So you can go back and kind of slot that stuff in and see how it makes sense. And I think that it worked out that way. I'll leave it to the readers to decide, but and another thing, Tom, as far as the cooperation is concerned, if it hadn't been for To the Stars, it hadn't been for the people you were talking to, these books would not have been as valuable as they became, because the people you were talking to and the advisors and all of this that we went through since 2015 on this really gave us the direction to go into. And it's been controversial, and it's still controversial, but it actually showed us which direction to go. It was a gentle guidance saying, why don't you look over here and why don't you look over there? And that, otherwise we would just be writing UFO books, and it would just be, sightings, and it would be trying to prove the UFO phenomenon. Instead, because of this collaboration, we started from the basic point. The UFO phenomenon is real. It exists. Like the t-shirt says, Tom was right. Yeah. We start from that as the basic starting off point. So we're not here to prove the UFO phenomenon is real. We're here to show what is the implication of it being real. How does it affect everything? How should we really slot this into our vision of reality? And I think that's what this was. That's why this was such an elaborate undertaking. And you shouldn't put your involvement in any kind of secondary way. If it hadn't been for all those advisors, it hadn't been for the meetings that you had, that we had, all of this just would not have happened the way it did.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I agree. I 100% on that. Tom, you really were a sort of a driving force among everything. TTS wouldn't be here, right? If you weren't there. So, and now, Peter, you pretty much answered that question. And Tom, I'm sorry, was I cutting you off? Or did you want to?
No, hey, I just wanted to. The only thing I was going to throw out was, if you remember the very first section of Gods, the first book of this, where Peter describes mankind as a cargo cult.
Yeah,
that was the key that opened the very first door for me with one of the generals. Just because I never went and talked to any of these guys about programs or what they're working on or anything classified. But going in there and talking about this kind of, what would be the word, Peter? It's not the mythology or the cosmology of it. It's the overarching kind of description of what it. I was going in to talk about kind of more like, what is this? What's going on? And your version of the cargo cult was the key. So these books were so important. We look at this movement over 8 years, like you described or whatever. Like, look how far we got. We have people testify under oath at Congress that these things are real. These things are happening. It all started with Peter's cargo cult introduction. Was it the introduction?
Yeah.
Like, just that section is what I sent to one of these advisors, and he read that, and it was all caps. Wow, let's talk. Because what else was I going to say? I couldn't go there and ask him, hey, you know something I don't know. You're working on something secret. No, it was an academic, philosophical kind of approach to something that is real and happening, and that earned respect. So I got to hand it to it was teamwork. It really was. To the Stars has always been a team. So that's all I was going to say, Jim.
Okay. Well, both of you had this concept of a nonfiction Secret Machine trilogy in mind for God a couple of years before the first book was even written. Can you talk a little bit about, the vision for God's Man in War and why you found it necessary to write this trilogy? And then I guess throwing it in now too is what were you actually trying to get across? What did you want to get across? Yeah.
What I thought of when I reached out to Peter, I was listening to him talk. I was looking at some of the books that he wrote, and I was just like, this guy is like, he's just different. He's not running around writing about somebody that saw a globe of light in the sky. He's not just interviewing somebody that has missing time at night, like all the shit that we've been hearing about. He was a scholar of many different things, particularly of the esoteric and the occult, and how that intersects with, politics and nation states and history, and he was finding patterns and threads for the underworkings of the way things are. And so when I heard him speak on things like UFOs and other esoteric subjects, I was like, this guy's completely different. He's an academic. He's not just like regurgitating, the Roswell crash happened in 47. It's like we've all seen all that stuff. It doesn't answer any questions, and there is no new information. The only new information I was seeing was coming out by very few people, and he would be one of them, that had an ability to put together patterns and threads on a very deeper substance of what's happening within humanity. So I reached out to him and I was just like, I think that you would be the perfect guy to put together 3 books on UFOs that are not your typical run of the mill, like here's a sighting, Betty and Barney Hill, and just like, Phoenix Lights, just all the dumb shit that we've seen for decades. But like, what the fuck is going on Earth? Like what, there's something that's threading together consciousness and socially engineering mankind into a certain thing. And then what the fuck are we going to do about it? And all that seemed to be able to be spread out amongst 3 books. And then Peter started architecting this idea. And now I'm speaking a little bit for him, is like, this is how I would want to do it. And then Peter, take it from here.
Well, yeah, exactly. This is the thing. The reason that I felt enthusiastic about this project in the first place was because of your initial contact. At first, of course, I didn't think it was you. I thought it was a hoax, right? I thought, yeah, sure, it's Tom DeLonge, Blink-182. Yeah, right. Okay, next. And then eventually I did, come to realize this really was happening. And then, Tom's point of view was, I remember distinctly what you told me. You said, we're going to knock on doors. We're going to go wherever we have to go. We're going to get to the bottom of this thing. We're going to do whatever we have to do to get there. And that's like a completely different approach than anybody else that I've ever talked to about the UFO stuff. The UFO people are like, the government's hiding it from us. We're never going to know the truth. Did you see this document that was online or this thing? And it's just like, when you do research for a living, you know how you're supposed to do research. You know how you're supposed to talk to people, find out, as much as you can about facts and not just speculate endlessly. And Tom is saying, we're going to go and actually go there. We're going to go to the Defense Department. If we have to. We'll go to the Pentagon. We'll go to these people. We'll knock on the doors and find out. And I said, in that case, I'm in, because why not? This is the way, this would be the way to go. And we went unapologetically. It's like Tom goes up to these guys and it's like, it's not, you bastards, you're hiding the secrets from us. We're always, like in that old X-Files episode. No, we're saying, okay, we know you got secrets. We know there's stuff you got to keep, there's national security implications. Sure. We're on your side. Tell us what you can tell us, right? Give us something. Point us in the right direction. And I thought that was the best approach to take. This confrontational thing was not working. And the UFO community was like totally confrontational. The government's lying to us, right? And that was it. And we were talking earlier during the break, Jim, you were talking about, this idea of manipulating reality and misinformation and stuff. That started with Roswell, didn't it? I mean, that started then.
It did.
We were talking about flying saucers. People saw freaking lights in the sky. They saw Foo Fighters during World War II. But then later they're seeing lights in the sky. There's the ghost rockets in Sweden. There's all this stuff in the press. and the implication was these flying saucers were some kind of Nazi weapon, maybe, right? All this stuff was going on, and suddenly the lid went down. And that was the beginning, And then we get to the Kennedy assassination, which is how I got into the subject, weirdly. And the Kennedy assassination was another one of these things where, wait a minute, the Warren Commission looks like a work of fiction, right? There's missing people in there. People haven't been questioned. People, lied. This and that was going on. Something was going on. So this idea of distrust in the government was building. But I think it started with Roswell. I think it started in 47, really, this distrust of what was going on. And then, of course, the Red Scares and McCarthy era and all the rest of it. So we built up this head of steam where we couldn't trust anybody or anything. And I'm from that generation. I'm a little older than you, Jim, not by much.
Not by much.
20 years, maybe. And, I came of age during, the assassinations, Vietnam, and all the rest of it. So you learned to distrust. But at the same time, you cannot be so naive as to think the whole thing is a scam and the whole thing is a conspiracy. And there's this deep state controlling everything. There are good people in government. There are good people everywhere. There's good people everywhere. And if you just walk around with the blinders on and say, well, it's all a hoax, yeah, okay, that's fine if you're on a mystical quest, right? And if you're on this spiritual quest where I'm going to question everything and it's an interior kind of thing and you're trying to find your true self, maybe, okay, I can understand that approach. But when you're externalizing all of that to the rest of the world and saying everybody's out to screw you, everybody's out to manipulate you, don't trust anything, well, then you got to be careful. Then you've got to become savvy. If you're talking about the government, and I had experience with government from another angle. I was in business for a very long time and international trade. So what happened was I'm always dealing with the U.S. government, right? I want to export computers to China back in the 80s, right? No, you can't do that, right? You had to get approvals from CIA, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, all the departments in government. And then you had to get approval from Paris with a group called COCOM. They all sat around a table and decided, all these NATO countries, if you could actually ship that computer to China. So we had to go through this all the time, right? So you began to get very used to government, dealing with government. And you realize the government is not what people think it is. You have to be open to understanding how it works. And I think that's what's missing in a lot of UFO mythology, is the idea that there's this huge cabal of people, hiding behind a wall somewhere, and they're smoking, big cigars, and they have maps out and they're plotting the destruction of the world. And it just doesn't work like that. And once you get rid of that and you start talking to people, as Tom did, as Tom who broke the ice on this, you're able to get information. Now people are starting to talk. People are saying, okay, you're not crazy. You're not fanatics. You're not conspiracy theorists. You're asking us these questions. We're going to answer as much as we can. And I think that was just, I'm really over answering this question. I realize that. We're like,
yeah.
4 hours into this. I'm over answering. But yeah, I dealt with, some of Jim's people in the past and some of the other people, very nice people. I mean, if they're hiding things, they're hiding it because they have to, not because they want to say, ha, I'm hiding something. So you learn to kind of do that tango. You learn to do the dance. You learn to find out how far you can go and what's real and what isn't. And that's really very valuable. And I think that informed how we wrote these books. We said, we're going to go and look at this in the cold, hard light of day. We're going to get rid of some of the weird speculations. We're going to try to approach this honestly. And I think that's what we tried to do here.
I also think, too, the process, since we've been putting these books out and getting the government, we changed To the Stars, our team, really changed the DNA of the subject within the government hall. So now, as you were writing these books, it's fairly easy to talk to those who have knowledge of the subject within the government, whether they're current or out of the government, to have a normal conversation about the stuff as long as you stay away from the classic areas. That wasn't really the case like a decade ago, but over the past kind of 8 years, we can have a conversation with somebody that's working at one of the defense contractors, or might be working on one of the task forces with Congress or national labs or something. I mean, obviously they have rules they have to adhere to or whatever, but it's not weird. I've had many conversations with people that were in current positions just about the subject as a whole. And, it's what needed to happen, because it's nature. And it's kind of, for the longest time, we couldn't talk about nature. Why? Because there's all these, it's just such a big secret. We're all like, okay, well, now we can talk about the monsters in the ocean a little bit. And that's what needed to happen. And it took a healthy dose of respect, because what I found out is a lot of these guys, a lot of these things were secret because they need to be. And then a lot of things are secret because it's just by virtue of the architecture of how the law works. It's attached to something, or that's just like how it works. It's not because there's a nefarious plan. It should like keep us all in the dark. It's fine print on the paper that like, it's just kind of how the lock mechanism works. We got to, so it's just, but the way you described it, Peter, is totally on point. Like, it's like a big cabal of people with cigars going, we know everything. I was like, people are just naive. And I was one of them, and I'm just happy that we're getting to a better place.
Yeah, very well said. I agree with both of you. Now, one of the things I really like about war is that much of what you both believe, what many of us in TTS believe actually, is stated in the first few chapters of the book. I mean, you guys get it right out there. And in the first part of this interview, I want to spend some time on these important ideas and concepts. And for example, and if you allow me this is from the introduction to the book, but allow me to just do a quote. And I'll start the quote here. The quote is, "It is hoped that this project will inspire a new generation of scientists, engineers, and researchers, philosophers, psychologists, astronomers, geneticists, and artists, people from the hard sciences, the soft sciences, the humanities, and indeed from all walks of life, to reevaluate the evidence, to reimagine our society as a space that includes some of the seemingly fantastic and irrational elements of human experience, integrated with its more rational and familiar aspects, in order to create new ways of understanding the complex matrix of knowledge and experience, of intellect and emotion, of artistic and scientific creativity we call reality." Now, that's a lot. I mean, that's saying a lot. And my question to both of you would be, do you see this actually happening already? I think the answer is going to be yes, but I really want you guys to expand on this, because you're talking about blending together all these different academic, disciplines, where before it was just a physicist who was going to talk about UAP. And now you're saying, oh no, it's got to be everybody. Go ahead. Yeah.
What's interesting, I saw on Instagram today, Peter, that you might like. Well, I saw this guy talking about the soul. And he says, if you were to go deep on like a microscopic, kind of as small as you can go, that we're 99.99999% of vacuum. He said, but somehow the cells know how to divide and replicate. And then at some point, they know where to go three-dimensionally to start becoming a liver or a kidney or bone or whatever. He's all because there's an energy field that's dictating where all those parts go. And everything's being drawn off that. And my point is that there's something that glues it all together to work, right? And that reminds me of what is said in that text that he was just reading, is the fact that we need all these things from religion and the sciences and consciousness and all this stuff to kind of go deeper. There's something gluing it all together. And once we start looking at it holistically, like a naturopathic doctor does, like how do we holistically heal the body? You're not going to heal, your blood pressure unless you holistically look at everything. I feel like that's how the UFO phenomenon is. Like, we have to inspire all these artists and politicians and philosophers and scientists and geneticists, and everyone has to start coming together to create a unified field theory of what this all is. I don't know. So I was inspired by that thing I saw today.
I think, you're putting that's it. I mean, that's what this is all about. That's, I think, what To the Stars is about, basically. By blending the fiction and the nonfiction, that's a way of doing that, right? Because people can understand the nonfiction to an extent. They get, there's science involved, there's math involved, there's, history of religions and cultures and, all the other stuff we'll get into a little later. But what's the story? What's the narrative? How do we put that together? How is it relevant? When I'm sitting outside at night and I look up and I see one of these freaking things, now suddenly I'm not a scientist. I'm not a physicist. I'm just this guy standing there looking up and seeing it. What is that moment? What does it consist of? There's consciousness. There's the senses, right? I'm perceiving these things. There's my psychological reaction to what I'm seeing. There's all this stuff. And yet when we're talking about, researching UAPs, it's a bunch of scientists in a lab somewhere or engineers. They're missing part of the equation. They're saying it's not important, or we just don't know enough to look at it. We can't use that data. But what do we have in this country and around the world? We've got experiencers. We've got contactees like crazy, right? And we're sitting there ignoring them because we think maybe what they're saying has some validity, but we can't measure it. We can't weight it, in terms of science and physics. So we got to ignore it. And that to me is the mistake. The input is waiting for us to use. The data is there. We can apply a scientific system to evaluating all that contactee information, all of those experiencers. They have something to share. That's not to say they're all telling us exactly what they saw. We know what it's like in a court of law. You got, eyewitnesses to an event, right? So you got 3 eyewitnesses, you got 3 entirely different stories of what happened, right? That's a problem. But the main issue is all these 3 witnesses saw a crime being committed. They saw something. Maybe the guy had a red sweater, maybe he had a blue sweater, maybe he had a gun, maybe he had a knife. We don't know. But somebody got killed, right? Somebody was attacked. And that's the UFO phenomenon. We got to start from there and sort of take a longer view, go back out and figure out, why is this person seeing it this way? And why is this person seeing it that way? Is there any common threads going through here? All this stuff. And who's better to building a narrative like that, to looking at it and turning it into a hypothetical that we can work with in science than the artists, the people who deal with this emotional content and psychological content all the time. Musicians, artists, writers, painters, sculptors, these are people that deal with this all the time. They're in touch with something within themselves. They're in touch with the experience out there. They are externalizing this experience. These are the people we need. We need input from them as well, not just from the scientists. The nuts and bolts guys, they're going around in circles right now, aren't they? If we believe the stories we've heard, they've had a crashed craft from Roswell since 1947, and they still can't figure the friggin' thing out, right? They're using the wrong people to analyze it. Bring somebody else in who thinks outside the box, who doesn't even know where the box is, right? Who looks at this thing and says, well, maybe it's this, or maybe it's that. Have you thought about this? And it's going to sound crazy, but it might be the missing piece. And this is what I think this is all about. We need to bring all these people together. This is about all of us. It's about the whole friggin' world. It's about our reality. We think we understand reality. We don't have a clue. I mean, if one of these things flies in front of you, right, it does a 90-degree turn in midair without missing a beat, without decelerating, and without accelerating, goes off in another direction, maintaining its constant speed, then suddenly stopping on a dime, dropping down, going back up again. It's telling you, it's showing you, you don't understand reality. You think you know, you don't. We're showing you something else. And all we can do is sit there with our mouths open and we're gaping at it. We don't know where to start because we think we know reality. Our background tells us, no, this is the real world and it works like this. And one of these things comes along and it challenges everything. It throws everything we think we know into a bucket and it says, start from scratch.
This is the fucking thing about the universe. I'm so baffled by how much we don't know. I heard this one physicist say, if the universe was all the oceans of the world, we've studied half a cup of water, And so the other day I was like, okay, so if time is a attribute of space, and if you travel through time, and I had this whole concept, and we have a friend that used to work over at Lockheed that worked on the big classified aerospace projects or something, all the cool shit. And I emailed him or I texted him this whole concept of time. And I was actually kind of right in a way, like this thing that I texted him was so out there, but it was only from an artist's point of view, because I can't dig into the facts. I'm not smart enough to understand the minutia of all these concepts. But with someone like Peter or some of our like Steve Justice, the engineer from Lockheed that worked out to the stars, or these guys that dig deep into something, and they just come with the end result, the conclusion of the study. I'll go, okay, I get the conclusion. I can paint those in my head. And I think I did pretty well over the years with the UFO phenomena on some concepts. And I think that's why it's cool to take different people together and put them at the same table. And To the Stars was about that, honestly. I mean, we got Jim, who spent a lifetime, at the CIA, and you always told me you were surrounded by architects and you were surrounded by guys that were religious scholars and just like all these different types of PhDs. Then we took someone like Steve Justice, who was arguably second or third command of the Skunk Works of Lockheed Martin, the biggest and best, most elite aerospace engineering group. And then you had guys that were program director scientists like Hal Puthoff, who is just like at the tip of the spear when it comes to like experimental physics. I mean, you get all these guys at the same table. I mean, boy, does that conversation change. It's not so like you said, Peter, it's not just in a box. There is no box anymore. It's like, we're going to redefine what the box is, and it might be a circle,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree with you guys more about that. It's really fascinating. I think, what we're doing is we sort of have to layer, this whole idea of, psychology on top of sociology, on top of physics, on top of, religious studies. And this is blending of academic disciplines. And that's sort of the only way you're going to ever get around to understanding this phenomenon. At least that's the opinion I know you guys share and I share with you. But let me go a little bit deeper into the introduction, because there's something, at first I considered controversial, maybe even highly controversial about it. And basically what you guys are doing is you're talking about academic life in the U.S. and how governments and the military are the only institutions that really are able to fund research studies, things along those lines, because they're the ones who have the money. Including corporations, which are funded by government grants and contracts that enable them to survive. And let me quote this. He gives this quote here. And, you say, this results in a relationship between governments, the military, and corporations that President Eisenhower famously characterized as the military-industrial complex. And then you go on and you say, in fact, it is entirely possible that the power of governments is circumscribed by the military-industrial complex to the extent that control of information concerning the phenomenon is carefully monitored. Now, when I read that, I was thinking like, well, that's interesting, because, if you talk to Jacques, Vallée, he'll tell you that the phenomenon is probably primarily a control mechanism, and that when you look back at this and you're saying, well, the government is sort of working as a control mechanism also. You guys want to expand on that a little bit?
No.
I
don't blame you. Let's go to the next question. Okay, nice.
I got a hypothetical for you, Jim, that might answer his question. Hypothetically, if there was something that was really dangerous because it's unknown and it's advanced and it fell in our footsteps here, and we needed a certain type of scholarly look at it that existed in the civilian sector, and we're the government. And if we had to do a deal with this, and this could be any kind of defense contract, you're now involving a corporation, a private corporation or an American corporation or something, but civilian. You have to create governmental title authorities of how to work with them. And just by means of the law, the government now can't do what it always does, because you have to operate under what's best for the corporation as well, right? Isn't that just by, I'm trying to get people to understand how we work with corporations in the Defense Department in general. I mean, can't the government not do things sometimes because the corporation has its own interests if there's a joint venture?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good point. And, in my agency career, at least, and I dealt in a lot of these contractual relationships, particularly if we were working with a U.S. citizen or a large company or even a small company to get to the bottom of a certain technology or to help us understand a certain technology, you would have to engage them sometimes in sole source contracts, because you didn't want everybody in the government knowing that you had a particular issue, right? You tell a friend, you tell an enemy. So you devise these contracts, and the contracts are very specific, and they basically say, now until the end of time, you're not going to be able to discuss this publicly. And we will never acknowledge, the government will never acknowledge that a U.S. corporation had anything to do with this particular technology. They can't, because a corporation would be liable for all kinds of things. I mean, their stock might go down. I mean, it just, and plus the people that are working there would be, exposed to the press, and they didn't sign up for that. They're actually there to help the government. So you get into this, and it's sort of I don't want to call it a quagmire, but what happens is, you do what exactly happens with what Eisenhower said. You get into a complex, and it is a military industrial, and it's government industrial, not necessarily military industrial. And you have to protect each other's interests, and doing so requires a good deal of secrecy. That secrecy does not end after 25, 50, 75, 100 years, because people live a long time, right? And corporations live a long time. And just because Lockheed Martin used to be called something else, and now it's changed its name 2 or 3 times, well, you still have to protect that company and the original company every iteration of that company. But you're absolutely right, Tom. And I think that's part of the problem we have right now with all of this. But Peter, you want to add to that, or?
No, I mean, you're explaining it succinctly. I mean, just exactly what was intended. I mean, if you want to talk about the phenomenon, but you have the military industrial complex involved in this thing, right? Basically controlling information where this is concerned. And, probably the more secretive aspects, the more phenomenal, aspects of the problem is under a tight control. They're not going to give it to the government in general. They're not going to go to Congress and say, hey, they got this really weird spacecraft and these 2 dead aliens. What should we do with it, right? That's not going to happen. So right away, you have a line drawn between government and the military industrial complex as a separate entity. Government, yeah, to an extent. Elected officials, not so much. When you have an elected official and they lose their election the next year, right? And you've told this elected official something earth-changing, right? What's to stop this person from using it in some way? In a good way, in a bad way, revealing it, or just getting freaked out by it and leaving it in his memoirs, right? So this complex does control a lot of what we know about the phenomenon. It controls what the military-industrial complex knows about the phenomenon, which may not be everything that we know about it, which is why I'm saying bring in the other people, right? Expose other people to this, because as long as it's in the tight little grip of that military-industrial complex, the rest of us may not know. But let me just fall back 1 second. We are in a very dangerous position now in the world in that everybody has access to information like they never had before. And they have access to direct experience of the phenomenon like they never had before.
Yeah.
Isolated individuals, the Betty and Barney Hill that Tom brought up, or, Roswell, or any of these other, Phoenix Lights, et cetera. These are, isolated cases of people saying they saw something. But now we have a massive information structure, which didn't exist at the time of Roswell, for instance. Hasn't existed really only for about 10 years or so in the way that it is now. And it's growing at a tremendous rate. Every human being on the planet is going to have access to direct experience. You can't control that anymore. All you can kind of do is control the spin. Try to tell people that what they saw, they didn't see, right? Or try to explain what they saw in ways that, well, that's, what you saw was military aircraft. This is test aircraft, right? They're not UFOs. Or it's like they used to say, it's the planet Venus, or it's swamp gas, et cetera. You'll come up with reasons for it. That only worked when you were dealing with individuals. When you're dealing with masses of people with access to that information, with cell phones, with cameras, taking videos, taking pictures of it, now you're in a whole other world. You can no longer control the flow of information. So if you can't control the flow of information, you've got to make some kind of contribution to that flow, right? To protect secrets that might be, for national security reasons. But also you've got to get real flexible, because the more you lie with this stuff, the more you're going to get caught. There's just no way out. So
I have a question. Jim, I have a question. I think the listeners, I was speaking for the common everyday kind of younger generations of people that just, want to know. I have a question for you, Jim. Okay. So everyone knows the CIA is really fucking good at stealing shit, information, technologies, whatever it is. Can you give us whatever you're comfortable with? Like in your career, have you guys, if you personally been a part of something where you found yourself, where you had something phenomenal, but you needed other eyes on it, but the debate on the ramification of getting other eyes on it is really stressful. And let our readers know why you wouldn't bring a bunch of people in to look at this UFO related material, but like using an analogy of something else, like you've done something where, God, we got to tell people about this, but we can't. But what do we do with this? And why is it stressful to bring other people in when there's something kind of unnerving or dangerous that you're dealing with?
But yeah, and actually had many instances of that occurring. And generally, at one point I was running a joint group filled with military intelligence and, of course, in CIA. And what happened is you would get somebody coming to you, and it could be an analyst, it could be somebody from the Defense Department or maybe one of the services, and they would say, we understand that a particular country has been developing a certain technology, let's say, and this technology, if this is true, what we've been hearing on the rumor mill, and from our own sort of assets and, people are talking to us, this is really going to be a game changer. So they would come to me, and we were at the last resort, and we would say, well, okay. And then we were dealing with black market people, gray market people. We had our own assets all over the place. So I would say to the, whoever the person was, that, okay, give me 24 to 48 hours. Let me see if I can pull this off. And then I would get back to them and I would say either yes or no. Most of the time it was, yeah, we could certainly look into it. Here's what it's going to cost you to have my group look into it. And then I would go to some of the most creative, imaginative people you can imagine, both in the military and in the agency. And they would sit around, and these were analysts, operations people, tech people, and they would devise these ways to get to that information. And we would do that. And sometimes what we would find, actually, I'd say more than half the time we would find that, yeah, this technology is real. And yeah, we don't have it. The U.S. doesn't have it. And wow, this is a big deal. So what do you do with that? Now, if you used, say a U.S. person or a U.S. corporation to help you get that information, and sometimes you had to, that person might be fully aware of what that new technology is. I can't, that's the price, you pay for getting them to help you get it. So now you're sort of in a conundrum, right? You get back, you have the data, you give it to, say, the military, and you say, here you go. It costs you $10 million to get this. We got it for you. It works. And now the military gets it. And now you have this U.S. person or U.S. corporation sitting there saying, like, well, what do we do? Now we have it. And the answer is, can't do anything. But you can't let it out in the public, right? But if you take that information and you want to do something with it, yeah, you probably can, but the only person you're going to be able to sell it to is the military or the IC and funnel that back into the system. So with UAPs, I'm really practically certain this is exactly how it happened. In 1947, probably I think a couple years before, the president, Eisenhower, later on, and Eisenhower afterwards, but Eisenhower, and then later on Truman, basically went to the military and, I don't want to name anybody because I don't want to get my head in deep water here, but they chose, I think, two agencies to look into this stuff. They created what I like to, I like to tell people is the president comes up and says, here's a presidential executive action document, which basically gives you permission to start an unknown waivered special access program, which you have a right to deny anybody access to it, except the people that are read into it. It generally falls under the executive branch and not Congress. And then it generally would involve the private sector for security reasons, because the private sector has all these rules and regulations about proprietary information, which cannot be shared with other corporations, and it can't be shared with other aspects of the government, including Congress. So I think that's what happened. And I think it snowballed over the years and over the decades. And I think you got yourself in it. I don't think it's a cabal. I think what happened was it's one of these sort of benign bureaucratic roller coasters that just kept going, and it's still going today. And no one knows quite how to unravel it. So yeah, I don't want to get into too much more. We don't need to do that here, but I think that's what's going on. And like Peter said, I don't think you guys got to sit around having cigars, and talking about it. I think a lot of them are pissed off because they don't know what the hell to do. They may be sitting on a craft or a piece of a craft that they cannot do anything with. They're sitting on it. The government occasionally will give them money to look at it, and they're not getting anywhere with it. But it's to them, it's just material. It might as well be a big old hunk of rock. They don't know what the hell they're going to do with this. So it's sort of an unusual state of affairs. And then there's other aspects to it too, which I think are a little bit more sinister about how they were trying to protect it. I think some people probably went way overboard on doing that, but that's already too much. I don't want to block the flow of this particular conversation because I really want to get more into war. But That's my feeling, though. Tom, I hope that answers your question, Tom.
Yeah, I just think people don't know, people just don't know that guys like yourself, or when you deal with these authorities and these laws and the way it works, they think it's the cigarette smoking man thing. It's just the military complex is more like the military. It's complex. It's a complex contract. It's a complex. It's the working.
I'm not saying, by the way, that should prevent disclosure. I mean, in a way, disclosure has already happened, right? With a small d.
That's my guitar falling down. Things are falling down in here because we're hitting.
You have to be honest to God. Almost a moron not to see that the UAPs are real and the phenomenon is real. It's all over the damn place, right? But what we're not getting is the government acknowledging that. Although Arrow has acknowledged it to a certain extent, at least pre-Arrow, before Sean Kirkpatrick, they said, yeah, these things are real. We just don't know what the hell they are. I don't know if we're going to get anything more than that. Let me jump into something else real quickly. The book also discusses the extreme difficulty of nations, many of whom have been historical enemies with the U.S., working together to hide the truth of UAP from the world. In a smaller context, can you discuss the difficulty the U.S. has had in hiding UAP from the American population? And in a sense, whatever the plan for hiding UAP is leaked like a sieve, particularly in the last 10 years. What do you think about that? I mean, about secrecy. How do you view government secrecy? Do you see it as something that is absolutely necessary? Do you see it as something more sinister? Or do you see it somewhere in between?
Gosh, Peter, this is good for Peter. Peter, I'll tell you, my view is that you can either have a philosophy that mankind is inherently good, and if we stick on that frequency, then we'll make judgment calls just hoping for the best. But if you talk to Jim, he's like, CIA, we're very aware that half of the people read at a third grade level, and everyone's and it's like people are out there shooting up schools and lighting churches on fire. It's like, what are you going to tell these people crazy shit? So I don't know. I mean, what do you do, with those 2 points of view on you have something you want to tell people, but you're highly aware that most people are just fucking nuts, so I don't know. What do you think, Peter?
Yeah. I mean, the problem is we can't hide this phenomenon from the U.S. population the way the government thinks it's hiding it, right? They've lost that ability to hide it a long time ago. There's this idea that, I come across this all the time, and it's on social media all the time, that there was this secret agreement, that Eisenhower signed with the aliens, right? And there's like a contract, there's like an agreement that they've signed. And I'm thinking to myself, that's just not freaking possible, right? And for all the reasons that's not possible, the United States cannot hide. They can only hide what they know about the phenomenon, only hide what they know. They can't hide what you know. They can't hide what an experiencer experiences, or where somebody like me that, saw his first UFO a few years ago, long after we started To the Stars, right? Actually saw it over the sky in Florida, standing, a triangle-shaped craft with making no sound and the lights and the whole thing. And, me being stupid, looking at it and thinking, that's a weird-looking helicopter, and just it's not occurring to me. Like, there's a beat, and I don't realize I'm staring at the thing that I've been writing about. So you can't hide that. The government can only hide what it can hide, what it knows. And to assume that there is some agreement between the United States government, among all governments, and some alien force doesn't make sense. As a guy who wrote a lot of contracts in his life, with the Chinese as an example, I have photographs, I posted them online, the size of these contracts, and it's just to wire a building, to wire it for internet, So the contract is this thick. And, well, you can't see me. It's very thick. Okay, we're talking about 6-8 inches thick or more. And it's in the Chinese language. Then we have a copy in English. It has to be an accurate translation of the Chinese. And these are for people living on the earth. And it's for a relatively simple thing of wiring a building. And the contract was enormous. And we went through so many difficulties with translators, making sure everybody's on the same page with the. Can you imagine a contract between us and them? What would that look like? So I don't think that exists. I don't think there is this high-level kind of secret arrangement between governments and the UAP phenomenon. I don't think that's possible by any stretch of the imagination. We don't share a common language. We don't share a common understanding of laws. And anyway, how would we enforce a contract like that? Right? They could enforce it, maybe, in ways not so pleasant, but we can't. How can we enforce that? How can we say you guys broke the contract? Contract's over. And the UAP says, fine, screw you. How does this work, right? That means that the U.S. government really, we're giving it too much credit, right? We want the government to come clean. We want the disclosure. And at the same time, there's people out there saying, well, we don't trust the government to give us disclosure. Well, what the hell do you want, right? So you have to start from scratch. You've got to do it yourself. You've got to find out on your own what this all means. The government cannot control that. They can just control whatever piece of crap they wound up with at Roswell, if they did, right? And, so maybe some genetic code from a dead alien creature. I mean, who the hell knows? That's what they've got, right? You, as a human being on this planet, you have direct access, right? The government doesn't control when they show up. The government has no control over the sky. They just don't, right? We saw that with the Nimitz, we saw that with the Tic Tacs. We saw that with Fravors, where we control nothing, right? They do all the controlling. So why do we keep focusing on the U.S. government? Give us disclosure, tell us what's really going on, when they don't freaking know. They have more information than we do, I'm certain. But then so do the Russians, so do the Chinese, so do the Brazilians, the Argentines, the French. Everybody's got a piece of this puzzle. Everybody has something, right? But you, as an independent human being, can look up in the sky and start making your own determinations, as an experiencer, as a contactee. And there's going to be a lot of crap, right? People are going to write all kinds of stupid stuff. The aliens are coming here. They're benign beings. They're trying to help us. They're on our side. Or the converse of that, they're going to invade the planet imminently and we're all going to die, right? So these are these two extreme points of view. Make up your own. Go out there and figure it out, right? There's a lot of books on this subject. There's 3 I could recommend right away. And you can try to figure out this on your own. The government can only hide what the government knows. And they don't know everything. They don't even know a tenth of everything on this subject because they haven't looked in the right places, right? So anyway.
I feel like maybe we need to reframe it to the people listening that it's not like the government's hiding what they know. I think the government's not talking about what they're trying to learn and understand.
Okay.
Maybe that's kind of a way people can we could frame it. It's like the government's kind of like, we have no comment about all the things you see in your religious texts and all these experiences that are going down, whatever. And we're just no comment on something we're trying to understand. And it's taken us a long time because, as I think it was Steve Justice that said this, it's like handing an iPhone to a cow. It's like, we're just not going to talk about what we're trying to learn about right now because we don't know everything. But we all as civilians are always like, the government knows everything, tell us. But they're just like, we just have no comment. Because one of the things one of the generals told me that I always thought was so telling, he goes, it's right out there in front of everyone's nose. It's like we're just not talking about it, but it's right out there at the tip of your nose for everyone to see. And it's happening everywhere. And I took that as far as like in Peter's line of work, all of his scholarly work on religion and the esoteric, the occult texts and all that kind of stuff. And it's in religious experience, spiritual experience. It's happening every day, everywhere. And just because the government has no comment, it's not like they're trying to tell you it's not real or something. I know they have done that in the past. Some people have done stuff like that. But I just think as a whole, and everyone knows the government doesn't work harmoniously together perfectly like some big perfect organism. Everyone's kind of out doing their own thing. It's a big company. I think it's more, maybe if we frame it more like that, it's easier for people to understand. They're working on something and trying to understand something, but they have no comment on the other shit that's happening to everybody all for thousands of years. It's right there in the front of their nose for all to see and to feel, to touch and to hear. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I used to try to explain to people, I said, particularly dealing with like CIA, when you run across something that's novel and new, no matter how strange it is, you have an obligation, particularly in CIA, is to look at this. You can't ignore it. UAP is a perfect example. You simply cannot ignore it. It is there. And if you find a 1 in 10,000 chance that it could be, low probability, high impact event, that's what you would call maybe a landing on the White House lawn, you still don't ignore that. I mean, you put some funds towards it, right? But if you're not getting anywhere with it, you're not going to throw $50 million a year at it. I mean, because if you're not getting anywhere with it, but you still don't you don't leave it alone. I remember when and I think I've told you guys this before, when the remote viewing program was running, and CIA had it. And I remember when they shut it down, and now they shut it down. I think somebody else picked it up right afterwards. I don't know who, but when I found out from a good friend of mine who was actually in charge of everything, very senior guy at the agency, and I asked him, I said, well, why? Because I had read, all the successes they had. And he said, we had to shut it down. He said, we couldn't explain it. He said, there was no way. He said, we couldn't go to the president and give him an intelligence assessment and say, we have high confidence in this because it's been accurate, say 70% of the time, which is pretty damn high confidence. But when the president would ask you, well, where's your source? And you'd say, it's a guy who's sitting in a room who, we gave him some coordinates and he went out on his silver cord and he's out there, and he's seeing this. And the president says, well, how is he doing that? And he says, well, he's out on his silver cord. How you want to, he just takes his, he goes out. And the president goes, yeah, I get that. And he said, but how does that work? What's the physics? What's behind all this? And you would say, we haven't a clue. Now, that does two things. Number one, you can't prove it. And you have no way of proving it because you've tried to figure it out. Ask Hal. Hal ran the program for about 20 some years. He tried to figure it out. He couldn't figure it out. He's one of the top, physicists in the US. And, the other point is, well, what do you end up doing with it? And I think that's sort of the conundrum that we have with the phenomenon in general, this whole idea. I think when the Russians were in the 20s and the 30s, were experimenting with psychokinetics and clairvoyance and telepathy. I mean, they discovered these things are all real, right? I mean, they actually do work, but they only work sometimes, and maybe some people are really good at it, some people aren't really good at it, but they couldn't really find a way to use it or weaponize it in any way. Well, when they started doing that, we had to start doing that. And I'm sure if we develop something along those lines, they're going to do it too, because nobody wants to be on the bottom rung of a new technology. Okay. So anyway, let me jump ahead real quick here. This is something that I heard Colm Kelleher discuss once when the Skinwalker book came out. But in the book, you also address it. You said that you discussed this idea that there are simultaneously two sets of ideas in our heads regarding the phenomena, the nuts and bolts aspect and the consciousness aspect, along with the emotion and psychological responses to that contact. And you state that we need to look at both aspects and in some detail. Well, my question is, how do we do that? And what would that type of endeavor actually look like?
Yeah, you got that box problem again, right? You have this one box and it's the nuts and bolts, right? And that's where science industry is focused on the nuts and bolts. Then you have this other box, which is most of the experience that we have with the phenomenon is on the consciousness level, not on the nuts and bolts side, right? We're getting more nuts and bolts information because we're up there now. We have aircraft in that space where we never used to have it before. We have submarines in the ocean we never used to have before. We're plummeting, all these areas of reality that we have around us in ways we never had before. And we're still ignoring the consciousness aspect of it, except I think we're getting closer now to answer your question, what would that type of endeavor look like? I've been very involved since writing Sinister Forces back in the day about this idea that, what is consciousness? Is it an emergent property of the brain, like Chalmers would say? Or, is the brain an emergent property of consciousness? Does it work the other way around? Is there consciousness first, as Tom was alluding to earlier, right? How the cells organize themselves to create a human being. Is there a consciousness that pre-exists the physical self? If there is, there's the key to what this is, or it's one key to understanding what the phenomenon is. We start from there. There was research being done, for instance, on Alzheimer's, right? Alzheimer's is a terrible disease. And they find out, it has to do with plaque in the arteries and all this other stuff. But then some scientists were working along those lines. And I'm thinking now of Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose coming up with this idea of the microtubules, right? That there's these microscopic, entities in the brain that are the interface between our physical self and consciousness writ large, that there is a scientific basis for consciousness, that they're working on this. They're getting closer and closer, in fact. A lot of the things they predicted have come true. The fact that at the Planck scale, you can have, quantum effects without going down to, minus 0 degrees, ultimate, in order to get these reactions take place, all kinds of other stuff. I'm going to go into the physics. But the idea is that the physics and the biology is starting to come together. And when that happens, it's coming together in the consciousness field. Alzheimer's is a consciousness problem, isn't it? I mean, it's a problem of the brain organically. It's not functioning the way it should. Can you reverse it? Are microtubules, at the heart of this thing? This is just an aspect of people saying there is a connection between nuts and bolts, and the body is nothing if not a bunch of nuts and bolts, and consciousness. If we understand that connection, if we can start there, trying to understand what consciousness is and how it operates, we're getting closer to understanding the nuts and bolts, because everything we've heard about people discussing the phenomenon has been that we can't understand how they fly. It doesn't make sense. We can't understand how something could be inside of it, controlling it without being destroyed by the G-forces. All kinds of things that we assume, because we assume we know all about physics, we assume we have the basis of science, we assume these things can't be real because they don't obey science. Is there a consciousness aspect to the phenomenon itself, and definitely to the way we react to it? All these weird abduction experiences, Whitley Strieber's, entire oeuvre, based on the idea of being abducted and what happens during these experiences. There's a nuts and bolts aspect to it. He's taken aboard a craft. He's taken aboard something that's nuts and bolts, but yet he doesn't remember how he got in or how he got out, right? Did he pass through walls from his house on his way out to the craft, for instance? He's not alone. There's many experiences like that. That defies physics. So there's a nuts and bolts aspect. The nuts and bolts is, how does consciousness go around what we think of as the physics? How does it defeat what we think of our physical laws? And I think that's how we get closer to understanding the phenomenon, bringing together the nuts and bolts guys together with the consciousness guys. Because I don't think the nuts and bolts guys are making a lot of headway yet. I don't know. Maybe they have. It's a secret to us, right? But I think they haven't. And I think the consciousness people might be able to help out in this regard. They may suddenly see something the nuts and bolts guys just don't recognize because they can't see it from their science.
Yeah. I have an artist view of this. Now check this out. This is my working picture theory. I'm just trying to tie this together for us normal humans. They don't think like Peter and Hal Puthoff and all these other guys.
All right, come on, man.
No, so check this out. I used to hear Jacques Vallée say, I think this is a consciousness thing. And it always pissed me off because, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. I see this nuts and bolts craft in the sky. And I'm also, why are you bringing up this little shit with my brain? And UFOs are my brain. But it took me a little bit of time to visualize this. And this is just the artist Tom kind of version. So I said this in a previous podcast that science is only what we can measure and the tools we have to measure it. And anything else we would throw in religion or metaphysics. But once we create the tools to measure those religious, metaphysical things, that becomes science. There's going to be a point where we can discover the soul or consciousness with a tool, and then we're going to get this one unified fucking model of what the fuck the universe is. So if you apply that to the UFO, in the study of UFOs and UAP, if you think about, you have the nuts and bolts craft, and you also have people having these kind of consciousness type experiences, like they're abducted or they see something in a dream or the aliens come through their walls and plant a memory in their head or whatever the fuck. How do you merge these two worlds together? Well, if the universe itself, the fabric of the universe that's holding planets and stars and all this different stuff, if there's a physical kind of tangible fabric of space-time, and that fabric is what consciousness is, this field, this sponge that's holding particles within it. And you're traversing, and time is a dimension of space. So if you're traversing time, and we think that some of these craft are popping through time using frequency, then essentially what you have is a nuts and bolts craft traversing consciousness and popping through time, which is all the mind of God. We're all living within the mind of God. When you look at the universe as a giant infinite whole, it's one thinking organism potentially. I don't know. So I think that if we start to understand that something is can create a nuts and bolts technology that can traverse time/consciousness and pop in and out, and we see it, and it does things, and it engineers us to move a certain way, to think a certain way, to be molded a certain way. I then think that Jacques was right. I then start to think like maybe that's how we can blend the crashed craft in the desert to the person that has a weird dream and sees an alien and has a weird memory. It's something using that craft to traverse this thing that's powering the stars. That's the fabric of space time. And I don't know if that makes sense to anybody listening. Definitely don't know if it makes sense to you guys. But in my head, that starts to make a bit more sense, that what we see in the event horizon of physical matter is continuously growing like a kaleidoscope. When you twist it to your eye, and it's constantly growing and evolving, there's all these particles bouncing off each other, and time just gets imprinted. We see history unfolding, but something can traverse that time. And essentially it's traversing the consciousness that's creating all of this physical matter. And that to me is kind of where they all start to come together. And so so essentially these vehicles are traversing consciousness. Maybe. Hal will probably beat me up on this because I'm not saying all these things right. Maybe our friends over at the Skunk Works probably have a lot to say about this, and you guys do too. But I think that's where it blends together, because we used to always think that thing crashed on the desert floor. That's coming from Mars. That's an alien from a planet. And other people are like, not really. Like these things seem to have a lot of electricity and voltage in them, and they seem to pop in and out of our fabric. They seem to find geodesic kind of angular pathways from point A to point B and skip the distance in between. They're doing stuff that only relates to frequency and time and black holes and all this different stuff. So I kind of tend to think that these craft are traversing time and consciousness by means of their technology. And that's where you start to look at, like, we can learn a lot more about it by using our minds and meditating and remote viewing, and probably find out a lot more by studying the people. Like Jacques did this. He said, you can't study the craft. We don't have these. So let's study the people and their experiences. Well, that's studying, like you said, Peter, it's like the psychology of what happened to them and how they changed. They started a cult. They committed suicide. They got ESP powers. Some guy can move objects with his mind now because he had a UFO event. Some guy fucking got some prophecies from Fatima, and now they can go, they know that there's going to be something else that happens. Like, so that's all related to the woo-woo stuff, but I don't think it's really woo-woo. I think they're both totally connected. I think one's a technology to kind of like to traverse the woo-woo stuff. Does that make sense to you guys at all?
What I mentioned Hameroff and Penrose. I mean, they started because Stuart Hameroff was wondering where does consciousness go when someone's under anesthesia? He's an anesthesiologist, right? So he put somebody under for a surgical operation. And he's like, what happens, right? The person has no memory, no consciousness. They're shut off. And then they're shut on back again once the anesthesia wears off, right? And anybody who's been through anesthesia, as I have, I think a lot of people have, they ask that question. It's a nuts and bolts question. Consciousness disappeared suddenly, right? Then it came back and it was the same consciousness. It wasn't somebody else's. It was mine. There was a continuity, but there was a break. And in that break, there was nothing going on. And then suddenly it all came back again. And that started him on this road of trying to figure out what's the link between consciousness and reality, quote unquote, right? I mean, the explanation you just gave said it was like the regular guy's explanation. I don't know, fabrics of space-time. I'm not sure.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
It just made me think. I bet you anesthesia, this is my own belief, is that we are an antenna to consciousness. And I bet you that medicine turns off the antenna. It just turns off the power to the antenna.
Exactly the metaphor that I use. I use the metaphor that our brain is receiving consciousness. And just because a person dies, for instance, doesn't mean that because their radio is broken, doesn't mean the station has stopped broadcasting.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's still going on. The consciousness is still there. It cannot be destroyed like energy.
Our friend Lou Elizondo, who has a new book out called Imminent, and I've just finished it. It was a really nice book. But he stated many times, and even while he was with TTSA, and we're now TTS, for those of you out there who don't know, while he was with us and afterwards, he's always had the approach to the phenomenon, as a very cautious one, and that national security aspect should be our first consideration. Now, some critics have stated that Lou and also us, TTS, all three of us here, and maybe more of us, are fear-mongering by saying that. Are we?
Oh no, I learned this. You know, Jim, when I met you guys, when I met all the generals from the Air Force, other intelligence officials, when I met, these SES, Senior Executive Service, 2-star general equivalent civilians over their staff directors and staff members of like the different committees in the Senate, the one thing that I've learned is that I didn't know shit. And I didn't understand the gravity of having authority, and I'm not saying every human makes the right decision in government, but I'm saying we don't know. When I go to fucking the mall on Saturday and I go play a rock show in Dublin and I just cruise around and I say whatever I want to say on a microphone, I don't know what it's like about managing a piece of information that can literally make someone like my mom like lose her entire view of reality and shut down and not go to work, go into a deep depression, or someone else that's like a Columbine shooter, a kid that like decides to go out and like kill everyone because nothing on earth is what it seems, like there's real stakes involved in this stuff. I used to always think it's like Peter, I could go after what Peter said, the cabal of men smoking cigars. It's not like that. There's like real accountability that comes with authority over information. And one of the generals, the big one that we worked with, or that I worked with, that I got that I've learned so much from, was he had a degree in philosophy of technology, because he was heading up 10,000 scientists at one of our national labs. He was effectively put him in charge of the building of nuclear weapons and stuff. And so you have to imagine, like, they have to think through, if you bring a new technology out, what is that going to do to society? I never even knew that existed, that you would have to worry about that. You're, oh, great, we got the internet. Well, no one's really thinking, well, now Russia can hack it and do all this propaganda and fuck with our elections and stuff. Well, no, we were just trying to fucking order groceries to our house, So it's like fear mongering is ignorance to me when it comes to people at the levels of where you work, Jim, because you were really high up there at the agency, and it took you a lifetime to get there. And they don't fucking, like, all the time, I would think, they don't just like promote morons. Like, there's a lot of responsibility. So when people say, oh, we're all just fear mongering, they go, no, you do not understand like the enormity of creating the Manhattan Project and what that's going to do to the world. And that's why when we all watch Oppenheimer, we're like, whoa, that was a pretty big deal. Yeah, I guess that was a pretty big deal,
Yeah, I agree. Peter, did you have anything you want to add?
Oh, no, I agree 100%. But I think that there's, when TTSA started, just in 2016, 2017, when all that was going on, people were accusing us of fear mongering, right? You guys are plugged into the military industrial complex. You're plugged into the Pentagon. All these advisors you have, they're all military. And we're saying, like, but that's where you want a disclosure to come from, isn't it? The government, the military, the army. Yeah, but we don't trust them, And when we start talking about it, and we start having guys like Chris Mellon, right, talking about the implications for national security, right, of this thing. I mean, these are genuine implications. You've got to be, you can't be brain dead about this. If there's stuff flying around the heavens, and they're playing games with our Hornets off the coast of Southern California, and they're just like screwing with us, or they're shutting off our missile silos, turning them on again, you'd be an idiot not to think in terms of national security. Like, what is the implications of this, right? Shouldn't we find out what this is to protect ourselves? I mean, the government's responsibility is to protect its people, right? And now you're looking at a situation where they really can't, where this is concerned, if there is a problem. It's not fear mongering. What did George Washington say? Hope for peace, prepare for war. I mean, that's what you kind of have to do. You have to at least be prepared. Otherwise, people are going to look at the government and say, why didn't you protect us from this, right? Well, we didn't want to be fear mongering. That's the excuse. Give me a break, right? So it's not a question of making everybody frightened. It's a question of being cautious and prudent and wise and saying, we don't have a defense against this. How would we defend ourselves against it? Are other countries worried about this? Are other countries thinking the same thing? It was Reagan, wasn't it, at a joint session of the United Nations, who said, if only there was some alien intelligence attacking the Earth, we'd all be at peace with each other, right? We'd have to bury the hatchet because there would be this force coming from outer space. I mean, he was using it as a metaphor, but yeah, basically, right? But we're still at each other's throats. The fear mongering is there, countries fighting each other. or fighting internally. That's where the fear mongering should be, right? But instead, they're talking about, oh, you guys are fear mongering. You're talking about the possible threat. It is a possible threat. We have to think in those terms. And if you're in government, you have to think in those terms also. You have no evidence to show otherwise.
That's right.
When they come around and screw with your missile systems and they play games with your aircraft, where is the rationale for thinking these guys are nice guys, right? How do you come up with that? You have to think in terms of a threat. There's just no other way to do it. But that doesn't mean you get crazy and you start shooting at them, right? It just means, let's see what happens. How do these things work? How do they operate? When do they show up? Start collating the data. Start coming up with
which might take decades to do, and it becomes so complex. And Jim, I really keep asking you questions because I think a lot of our listeners want to hear from you. If you're back illegally and people that work for you come to you and say, we just caught some guy trying to sneak in a biological weapon across the Canadian border, tell people what your series of events would be and why you wouldn't just run to the press and tell everyone about it. Like, what would you do?
I mean, the first thing you do is got to find, hey, who is this guy? Where is he from? Is anybody, is he working with anybody? And if he's working with somebody, okay, find out who they were from. Where did he get the biological agent? And that's a whole separate ballgame because you got to take the biological agent, you got to ship it off to someplace and find out. And almost every biological agent, in this particular case, would leave a marker somewhere in there. You would sort of have a pretty good idea what lab it came from, or if it came from a private lab or what have you. You would hope at least that would be the case. But yeah, it becomes very convoluted. But you're not going to go to the New York Times and say, guess what happened? Guess what we just discovered? Because you don't have all the facts. You have to get all the facts. And, I agree with you with UAP to a certain extent. I mean, I don't believe it's fear mongering. I just believe it's just wise, trust but verify. I mean, I hope that they're good people, but, they're not walking into St. Jude's and curing childhood cancer, right? They didn't do a goddamn thing during the Holocaust. They didn't stop, 20 million people dying in the Ukraine and Russia during, in between World War I and World War II. None of that stuff happened. But what they have done, they've gone into people's bedrooms. They've made a mess out of people's lives. Sometimes not, sometimes so. But we don't have a very full understanding of who they are and what they want and sort of their capabilities. But as far as the intentions go, nah, I think it would behoove us to stay on the cautious side. Let me jump to another quick question here, guys. This is related, but early on in war, you noted that if the reader derived anything of value from the first two volumes, Gods and Man, it should be that we have a lot of data on the phenomenon and a great deal of scientific and technological knowledge and advancement, but we still don't understand how to apply all that scientific knowledge to the accumulated data on the phenomenon. Saying the author asked, Peter, is there something stopping us? Curious what you mean by that.
Yeah.
You can jump in after Pete. Yeah.
I think you mentioned it earlier. The information is out there. It's in front of your nose, right? We have a lot of data on this phenomenon. What's stopping us is a bias, an internal bias against the data. I think that we are constitutionally we can't get it on board because we're trying to fit it in with what we think we already know about the world, about reality, about all the things that we know about. So we have a bias against looking at these things without the filters that we've grown up with during our entire lives. I mean, somebody like me grew up, first the Cold War, first it was hiding under your desk at school because the Russians were going to bomb us, right? You come up with certain kind of concepts that are ingrained from birth. And then you went through, the assassinations in Vietnam and Watergate and blah, 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 and all this other stuff. So you have a worldview. And then you're studying science. You're going to school and you're studying science, or you're going, in my case, also studying religious studies. And you have all this stuff in your head. And you have different hats that you put on, right? So we're talking about religion now. So I'm only going to talk about religion. I'm never going to talk about UFOs, right? I'm never going to talk about politics. I'm never going to talk about the military because we're talking about religion. Hello, we're slaughtering each other in the name of religion. There is a military aspect. There is a political aspect. There is a consciousness aspect. But we don't treat the disciplines that way. We keep them in boxes. We keep them all in separate cubicles. So we can't put it all together. something is stopping us, and it could be our culture, it could be our language, it could be just our environment. There's a lot of things in the way that we have to break down, we have to get rid of in order to get at what the relationships are between all the data that we have, because we probably could figure this out pretty quickly if we could get rid of some of those filters and get rid of some of those boxes and realize we're talking about one big box, if there is a box.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's in a nutshell.
Okay. Thomas, you have anything you want to add to that?
He said it with every single exact word that I would have said, because I sent it to him. What he just did, he basically just read what I emailed.
Exactly.
Yeah, he read my email.
Okay. Well, listen, before we leave, we haven't really gotten into a lot of the meat of the book yet. But before we leave the early stages of the book, I think, Peter, you write this, that if you learn anything about these 3 volumes, Gods, Man, and War, let it be the realization that the phenomenon is real. So it really freaks out everyone who has ever come into contact with it. That even though you think there is a cabal of magi in the government who know the truth and are withholding it, there isn't, at least not the way we think of, and we talked about that earlier. And C, there's a tension between the need of the governments of the world to tell their citizens what is really going on so that everyone can contribute to a solution. And then the other need to conceal as much of this information as possible, to deny other governments the intelligence is so absolute that we, the people of the world, have already lost the ability to defend ourselves from an alien invasion. Now that, I think, sums up things very nicely. But Tom, the purpose of this question was really to you. Was this the message that you were going after in, say, Monsters of California?
Look, I mean, in some ways, I think, the way I look at it is like, we're at this precipice with mankind where, it's like a Prometheus shit. It's like, here's a fire. You can use the fire to make food, or you can use the fire to burn down a village. And that's what do you do when you have a tribe of people that have been given fire and not everybody's like, united on how to use that fire for the greater good. So I think there's a really big issue where it's like, if everyone was living together harmoniously, then we wouldn't have to think about the military applications and the defense issues and, what it's going to do to people with religious views and what it's going to do to what, with what we thought, the potentials with genetics and biology and who we are and what we're, we have all these issues, outstanding issues, because we don't all trust each other. We have people living in caves that'll come out and behead people in the Middle East. We have people over here in our country that believe the world is flat, these flat earthers and shit. Like it's insane, like the disparity between all these groups of people and their visions of what we are and where we're going. So how do you just drop a nuclear bomb into all of that and say, hey, have you guys considered this? So, I remember one of my early conversations with some of these generals, where I was just like, it seems convenient that something crashes potentially, and then we spirit it away and try and study it. And because we can't understand it, it just furthers the secrecy. But we can glean a few things from it that help make better weapons of war. And then we just kill each other better. If anything, we're killing each other better. So if we were to look at that, and that's all we deduce from what's happened over the many decades of since when we first started noticing these craft, what if that was the plan? They're just helping us kill each other. That's a scary thought, so, but we have to think in all different ways. And that's definitely one of them. If we were all getting along, we wouldn't be studying this stuff and worrying about what Russia might learn from it or China or whatever. But we have, I'll always go back to a discussion I had with one of these guys where we have adversaries here between each other that we don't fully trust. And then we have an adversary from up there that we don't fully understand. So that leaves us in a place of just continuing secrecy and deducing just more weaponry or defense systems, or wondering what weaponry and defense systems Russia and China and others, North Koreans, are doing, whatever. And so everyone's just got this weapon gun behind their back. And we're like going, what do you got? What do I got? What do you got? What do I got? Versus how do we take something out of this technology that betters mankind as a whole, which I would err on the side that we have groups of people doing that. Who knows if the integrated circuit chip or the internet or any of the stuff that Philip Corso said came from some of this retrieved stuff. Who knows? Maybe we have had some leaps and bounds that have entered society and really pushed us forward in great ways, but that those technologies are still being used for bad things too. So I don't know, but I just think it's not so easy. I wish there was an easier way to present this to everybody where we didn't have to think of it in terms of secrecy and military application, but not all of us get along. I mean, I found out like, it's so funny. My mom, I always bring up my mom. She's highly religious. And, so something like, Noah's Ark is like a big deal to her. But I just found out, Peter, that Noah's Ark was basically written in the Zoroastrian religion, where they took 2 of every animal and went underground because of some kind of calamity that was coming. And I was like, whoa, I thought it was like Sumerian, but no, it's even older. Like we don't even know why we believe the things we believe, and we're still at each other's throats for it. So how are we going to drop this big charcuterie board in front of everybody and say, eat nicely off of it?
Charcuterie board. It's a good one. I like it. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna skip a couple questions here because I think we've answered them already. But in chapter 3, Peter, you mentioned Nazis and a possible Nazi UAP program. And I know Tom perked up when he heard Nazis, so we're gonna go.
I hate the fucking Nazis, but damn it, coming up with this topic, that was my only thing. I worst mankind has ever created. I agree with that, but I'm just telling you, they show up when we do a line, when we draw a line of where we are now to like the kind of the start of this UAP monster. It seems they pop up on that line, don't they, Peter?
They do. I know, absolutely. One of the reasons I'm glad Peter brought it up. Let me quote here, Peter. It is apparent from the available U.S. military documents of the immediate post-war years that a belief in a Nazi flying saucer technology was taken quite seriously by the U.S. The implication of this is obvious. The U.S. Army accepted that there was something to the flying saucer phenomenon, but they weren't sure whose it was. One gets the impression that they actually hoped it was a Nazi superweapon, for otherwise the conclusion that it was an alien technology was really unacceptable. Now, a little later in the chapter, you note the cogent arguments against the Nazis having this secret weapon. Could you please expand on that a little bit? And I'm referring to the logistical arguments against it that you made.
Sure. Yeah. The whole Nazi thing. I mean, we don't remember what it was like in 1947, with Kenneth Arnold and, those craft and all the stuff that was going on at that time. People were freaked out that the Nazis had super weapons because they had super weapons. They had the V1 and the V2, and they had long distance bombers, and they had all kinds of stuff that was going on, including they were really close to their own bomb, their own atomic bomb. So the idea there might be a bunch of Nazis someplace with super weapons was very real. And the first thing people thought of with the flying saucer thing was not aliens. Was it a Nazi super weapon? And then later, was it a Soviet super weapon? So all of these things, were there. They were percolating. And I have a whole chapter in the new book, in God's Man in War, on 1952. Just in 1952 itself was a scary freaking year, right? And we started off with a movie called Red Planet Mars about a Nazi scientist, an escaped guy from the Third Reich is in a mountain someplace in Chile or Argentina, and he's like faking, Martian messages and stuff. It's a really wild film that nobody really seems to know very much about, but it's really cool if you have a chance. The idea is that it was there. The people were afraid of this. It was a possibility. We had the Horton brothers who were actually designing flying saucers for the Third Reich. All this stuff was going on. They have, the designs that Kenneth Arnold saw were almost identical to the Horton design, which made everybody freak out even more. Oh my God, somebody has the Horton flying saucer design. Is it the Russians? Is there Nazis somewhere doing it? The problem with it was the logistics, as you pointed out. The logistics of an entire manufacturing process being hidden somewhere, being secret in those days, of the Nazis actually, being able to build factories, all the spare parts they would have to build, all the machine tools, all the workers, all of the raw material, whatever they were using for the craft, all of this would have to come from somewhere. You couldn't just do it in your backyard, in a garage somewhere. This had to be done, on a massive level. You would have to have a lot of people involved in it. And Nazis were being hunted all over the world. So it didn't make a lot of sense that the Nazis would have done this. And then, just because I like to do a plot twist at the end, and then I came across this thing that it's incredible. It's a document. It's as thick as, well, it's as thick as God's Man in War, which shows you how thick it is. A thick document that was published in 1945 by the United States government, by Congress, while the war was still going in Asia. The war had just ended in Germany and Europe. They published this document of all the German assets abroad, all of the German assets that had been expatriated to save them from the Allies seizing them. And it goes on for hundreds of pages. Assets all over the world, primarily in South America, but not only in South America, also other places in Europe and Africa and Asia. I mean, they were sending people, money, technical information. All this stuff was getting sent overseas in the last year of the war. The SS had determined that we're probably going to lose after D-Day. It didn't look good for the Nazis. So in order to save all this stuff, to rebuild Germany after the war, we had to get it away from the Russians on the one side and the Americans, French, and British on the other. So let's ship this stuff out. That includes, by the way, the submarine that was carrying uranium, fissionable uranium, and plans for an atomic bomb, and an entire Messerschmitt-type aircraft broken down in parts, and a whole bunch of engineers on board a submarine, which we apprehended in the last days of the war. A submarine that was visited by Oppenheimer, by the way. You didn't see that in the movie. Wow. So Oppenheimer was desperate to get to the end of building this atomic bomb, but he kept hitting up a brick wall. We seized this submarine that the Nazis had sent. They were sending it to Japan. We got a hold of it in the Atlantic. It's a matter of history. This is not, some weird conspiracy theory. And somebody looking a lot like Oppenheimer got on board that submarine, came back out, and within weeks later, he had the solution to the problem of the atomic bomb. Now, we don't know if those two things are deliberately linked or it was, synchronicity or just a coincidence, but these things happened. So the Nazis were close, and they were shipping stuff all over the world to rebuild. So yes, it doesn't make sense they would have built an entire manufacturing operation like in Argentina, for instance. That doesn't make sense. There's too many moving parts involved. But what if all that stuff already existed? What if they had sent all that stuff abroad and they had a platform for building a flying saucer already there, right? What if it was already there? What if it already existed? One of the founders of our rocket program was a guy called Theodor von Karman. And he went to Nazi Germany in the last days of the war. The war was still on in Europe. He went out there and brought with him his protege, which was a Chinese scientist called Chen Sui-sung. This guy was a brilliant freaking engineer, brilliant, a mathematician, engineer, and all the rest of it. He brings this guy with him. They're debriefing Nazi scientists, right? They come back to the United States and they tell Hap Arnold, because they went on General Arnold of the Army Air Force. And they told Arnold, what you got to do is build what the Nazis had. We need basically a military industrial complex. We need a society geared for total war. The Germans did that and they almost won, right? So we have to do the same thing here if we're going to be serious. So Karman got involved in that. There's a long story I tell in Sekret Machines War about the Chinese guy eventually wound up in China, and he jump-started the Chinese rocket program. And this was also a guy who was not just concerned about rocketry and spacecraft and all the rest of it, but also the paranormal. He wanted to weaponize the paranormal in China, just the way he had been learning from guys like Jack Parsons, who worked with Theodor von Karman in California at JPL. And they were also friends with Oppenheimer. It's a long, it's part of the story that you didn't see in the film. But my point is, there did exist a kind of infrastructure abroad in 1945, 46, 47 that the U.S. government was trying to stop. That basically was expatriation of money, material, intelligence people, scientists, engineers, and documents to rebuild Germany after the war, and including their secret weapons.
I got a question. I mean, so when you look at that always fascinated me. In some ways, the Nazi war machine, at least the upper echelon, the way they constructed that, they seemed so not in a box. They were open to merging their version of physics with the esoteric occult kind of stuff, which gave them leaps and bounds to do things that were really advanced. I mean, wasn't that kind of their view? Like, that's why I mean, isn't that kind of like their whole society, their whole framework of what they wanted to build and do, and was tied into like Atlantis and this ancient Aryan race and the ancient texts that might have been in Tibet or whatever. I mean, can you explain that? Is that what was going on?
Well, that did give them a kind of an edge, right? Germany, up until that point, was renowned as the center of intellectual learning. I mean, the most famous universities were in Germany. Einstein came out of Germany. I mean, all of these guys went and studied in Germany. The philosophers, the scientists, everybody was there. But there always was this, this little extra stuff. There was this tendency towards believing in these impossible things, right? So Germany was also a center of like some really weird occult movements. And there was a famous Ascona in Switzerland, which was, German speaking, where you had all these weird occultists from Germany would meet in Ascona, and they would have all these seminars and stuff. And eventually one of those things turned out to be the Uranus Symposium, which were Jung attended, Mircea Eliade, all these high-ranking, intellectuals would meet in Switzerland every single year also. It was kind of a free flow of information and concepts. Jung was there. He was part of the founding force behind this Uranus system. So Jung will be talking about the collective unconscious, right? And Jung was kind of, pro-Nazi for a while. There's a problem with Jung, having his fascist, fascination with Hitler and all this stuff. So you had the Jungian aspect coming in. You had Mircea Eliade. Eliade also had a bit of a fascist background in Romania, where he came from. People, disregard him a lot now because they found that out. They don't like that. So you had this kind of Nazi stuff, and you also had this, archetype, stuff from Jung. And you had Heinrich Himmler, who was like devoted to this stuff. And one of Hitler's major advisors, the guy who he dedicated part of Mein Kampf to, that worked with him in prison while he was in prison writing Mein Kampf, was, of course, Rudolf Hess. And Rudolf Hess was a big-time occultist, and he was the number 2 man in Nazi Germany until he flew to England and tried to get a truce with England or something.
Wouldn't that be like the paranormal we're talking about with Carmen and then that Chinese scientist? Like when you talk about the occult, it's kind of like weaponizing the paranormal in a way. Am I getting that right?
Well, Parsons was kind of in that world, yeah. Parsons was there, And on the other side of the globe, we had all the Nazi stuff going on as well, similarly. So you had people who were like that. Parsons, of course, was not a Nazi. So politically, he wasn't sitting there saying, we have a master race and a slave race and all the rest of the stuff the Nazis had. But there was this same openness to this idea, let's look in other directions. I mean, he was an occultist, very much so, ritual magic and all of that. And he applied a lot of that to his understanding about how to develop, weapon systems, how to develop fuel for rockets. They could be stored on board ship for lengthy periods of time. He's one of the founding members of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. They used to joke JPL. So it stood for Jack Parsons Laboratory, right? It was Jack Parsons thing, I mean, he was that deeply embedded with occultism on the one hand and science on the other. He was that kind of a person. And you also had that in Nazi Germany and in other countries around the world. In Russia, also, you had people like that. In China, you had Chen, who was doing the same thing. He developed the Silkworm missile for the Chinese and got them into the aerospace business. And at the same time, he was talking about how can we use Qi, and Tai Chi Chuan and, Chinese medicine in order to, manipulate the consciousness in order to control.
And this is like our talk about nuts and bolts and consciousness, the craft, and the weird experiences. You have people like the Nazis and some of these other dudes that you're talking about experimenting with physics and the occult, which is again nuts and bolts and consciousness. Am I getting that right? That's what fascinated by these guys that are spending real money with the brightest minds, getting together, almost took over the world. It's because they took away their boundaries and they're experimenting with the quote unquote paranormal with their sciences.
But you also see how dangerous that was.
Yeah. So do you think there's an evil to it? Maybe
it's not a question of evil. It's a question of there's a process of learning about these things that from ancient times involved a kind of a stages of initiation, right? So you were kind of brought into gradually. So you didn't lose your morality along the way and become like a rabid, cannibal or something. So there was a process, but, we abandoned that process when we abandoned religion and all of this. We thought it was all nonsense. We don't recognize the signs when we see it. In Nazi Germany, it was there. Parsons was actually part of the process. He understood there was a process. He never became this fanatic of blowing up innocent people. but he understood. He was part of a group that studied this, like, and you go step by step. The Nazis threw that out. They said, no, you don't need to do that.
Like, it's so powerful. If you don't go through the initiation steps, you're fucking with something that can really turn you into the wrong direction is what you're saying.
Right. Yeah.
That's wild to think about. Like, the science is like, so what I'm hearing is like, the sciences that might be behind what we look at as UAP and whatever, the sciences of the occult, of the paranormal, when those start to merge with physics and we start to have a greater understanding, if you don't have the appropriate steps and the appropriate morality throughout time, people go astray like the Nazis, and it can be used for bad. It could twist you all up.
Just like money.
Money. Okay. Yeah.
Too much money, you can become an evil bastard, right? I mean, all of this is power. It's power in one form or another. And if you don't have the constitution for it, you're going to abuse it. You're going to abuse that power. It's just that the temptation is too strong.
Yeah, let me interrupt 1 second. And what I want to do is I want to get into another aspect of this. And you started getting into it now when you're talking about Jack Parsons. And Peter, in other aspects of your work, I read where you talked about the Nine, and you spent some time talking about that famous seance attended by the Nine. And what I like, if it's possible, to talk about that a little bit and sort of explain the Nine, that whole concept of the Nine, and why this may be important to UAP followers. And because you write about this in War rather well, I might add. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I wrote about it in War. I've written about it before because I can't. It's one of these. I think, what's your word, Jim? Indigestible. It's one of these indigestible things. I love that term they use. The indigestible nature of this. And the Nine is indigestible to me because there's just something about it that doesn't make any freaking sense. But here you had, in 1950, 51, you had a group of people around a man called Andrija Puharich. And Andrija Puharich was a scientist and inventor. He was also a medical doctor. He went to Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, I believe, in California. And he got caught in a snowstorm up in a house that he was building in Maine or renting in Maine. And he was stuck there the entire time with a famous violinist from Romania or from Eastern Europe, Serbia, Croatia, I think. And anyway, so they start talking about all kinds of wild stuff. And Puharich gets the bug, about mysticism and occultism and that sort of thing, which in the 1950s was, not very strong yet, like it became. And it was still there, though. It was like underneath the surface. And he said, let's, bring some people together. They were trying to convince, his friends were trying to convince him, don't go back to California, forget that. Stay in Maine, set up your own medical institute, your own institute for studying science and for coming up with medical devices and stuff. We'll help fund you. We'll get some other people around to help you out. So one thing led to another, and he starts this Roundtable Foundation in Maine. And he has this small estate that he's working out of. And visiting Indian personage, a guy who was going to attend one of the World's Fairs, I think, was coming from India. And he had some background in mediumship, evidently. And he struck up a conversation with Puharich. They met on a train once, then he invited him back to Maine to hang out. And one thing led to another, and a seance took place. And the seance involved 9 individuals. It was Andrija Puharich, but it was also a DuPont, member of the DuPont family, an Astor, a member of the Astor family, and on. Like all the blue-blooded American wealth, the old money Americans had representatives at this seance. And the Indian performed the function of a channeler or a guru or something. And he started channeling, some intelligence. Puharich, being a scientist, decides, I'm going to trick this guy, right? Maybe this guy's a fraud. I'm going to ask him a scientific question that he would know nothing about. And he asked this question, and he got a really clear answer with a formula, the whole thing, the whole 9 yards, right? So he's paying very close attention. And the upshot of this thing is, and he writes about this, Puharich, there's no secret about it. He wrote it in a book about Uri Geller, because he was the guy who discovered Uri Geller, the famous psychic, and brought him to the United States. He writes about it. He says, this entity told him, we are 9 forces in the universe, and you are 9 individuals. You're going to be the Brahmins who are going to take this to the rest of the world, right? So there's this whole thing that gets developed that they're having a seance. They're talking with spiritual forces, these wealthy, well-heeled, well-connected Americans. And that might have ended there. My problem with the 9, and this is how I got into this subject in the first place, into the whole UFO field was because of these 9 individuals, because they freaked me out. And I started researching these people. Who the hell are they, right? And I went to the backgrounds of all these individuals and I said, holy shit, this is leading me down a rabbit hole I didn't really know I wanted to be down. Because one of the members of the 9 was Arthur Young, very famous inventor as well, and helped to invent the Bell helicopter during World War II. This was a guy who was deeply embedded in the military-industrial complex of the time. He left Bell Helicopter to devote his life entirely to studying the paranormal. His wife was Ruth Young. Let's call her Ruth Young. She had a lot of names. She was tremendously, let's call her Ruth Young. Ruth Young had previous husband here and there. One of them was kind of a Trotskyite or something. At any rate, Ruth Young was the best friends of a woman, Mary Bancroft, who was the mistress of Allen Dulles during the war and later. So she was real connected with Dulles through her best friend. They hung out together and did all kinds of things together. Her son, Michael, worked in Dallas, Texas for Bell Aerospace. Okay, so you're starting to see the connections. There's Arthur Young with Bell Helicopter. Bell Helicopter split off, became different companies. There's Bell Aerospace. They're headquartered in Dallas. On the board of Bell Aerospace is Walter Dornberger, famous Nazi general, Operation Paperclip. He was the guy who ran Peenemünde with, our good friend, what's his name? The famous Nazi, von Braun. Rainer von Braun. So they're all one big happy family. And Michael, is working at Bell Helicopter, and he's married to another Ruth, Ruth Payne. And Michael and Ruth Payne are married. They're Quakers. They have a house outside of Dallas. And staying at that house in 1963 was Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald and their kids. So how do we put this? Ruth Payne, that summer of 1963, goes to visit her in-laws. So she goes up to Pennsylvania, where the Youngs are located. She goes out and visits all the in-laws, the Paynes, the Youngs, and visits all of them. And she has this Russian defector sitting in her house, right? And the Russian defector's wife, they're there. They're famous defectors, right? They defected from the Soviet Union. Lee Harvey freaking Oswald. So they chat about all this with the 9, right? So she comes back down to Dallas and she manages to find work for Lee Harvey Oswald in the Texas School Book Depository. So she's the key person who does this. And then, of course, we know what happened. November, there's the assassination of John Kennedy. And who's the one who drops the dime basically on Lee Oswald? It's Ruth Payne. Oh, yeah, he stored his gun here. He had this here. He had that here, everything else. And he's begging Lee Oswald. He's begging them to call the ACLU to get him legal representation. It kind of slips their mind. Ruth Payne said, I forgot about it. And Michael Payne is doesn't understand it either. The whole thing, they all suddenly don't know anything. And of course, the rest is history. So I start pulling at these things, like, how is that possible? And at one point, Ruth Payne is trying to say what happened. She's in front of the Warren Commission. She's trying to tell her story. I had this guy who was living here. We all know you had Lee Oswald in your house. Yes, okay. Tell us the story. Well, in August, September, I went up to visit, Arthur Young. She gets cut off immediately by Allen Dulles. You can read the transcript. You can read the Warren Commission. Allen Dulles cuts her off right there, changes the subject, and we never hear the rest of that story, right? So I'm pulling at this thing. I'm thinking, okay, Arthur Young, Ruth, they were both at the 9. It's Andrea Puharich. Andrea Puharich is bringing Uri Geller to the United States. Uri Geller complained about Puharich, saying Puharich was his CIA handler, right? All this other stuff is going on. The 9 says we're going to, solve everybody's problems. Uri Geller says he's now in contact with the 9. They call themselves Spectra, right? And it's a spaceship. It's a flying saucer in low Earth orbit, and it's giving all these instructions to all these people of what to do. So here's this elaborate story, of all of these connections. Puharich, is working out of Edgewater Arsenal in the 1950s. Korean War has started, and he's giving lectures on the weaponization of the paranormal. How do we weaponize telekinesis? How do we weaponize ESP? These are official reports that he's making at Edgewood Arsenal to the military. He's now, I think, a captain in the U.S. Army during the Korean War period. So, you start pulling at one of these stupid threads. There's a seance in Maine, and suddenly, within 6 months, you have the UFO overflights in Washington, D.C. in 1952, right? You have the Air Force saying, well, if you want to know what these things are, really it's what's in the Bible, Ezekiel and the lights and everything else. You read the press conference of the generals talking about this, and they're bringing in the Bible, and that's their reaction. They're trying to oh yeah, it's the Bible. It's like that, it's things like that. Don't pay too much attention. And who's sitting there next to that general? But Ramey, the guy who was in charge of Roswell when the crash happened, right? He was in charge of that base. So he's sitting in DC next to Sanford, and they're giving their press conference on UFOs being, well, it's like lights in the sky like you saw in the Bible. And, there's stuff like seances and ghosts. They're talking about this weird shit. And it seems to be okay. The press is okay with it. Nothing to see here. Oh, it's biblical. Never mind.
Yeah.
There was the beginning. There was the actual beginning of what we're doing now, right? This tying in of consciousness, religious studies, the UFO thing. It's right there in 1952 with the 9 and with the overflights in Washington, D.C. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
It's like this invisible force organized people to get together, got to do something that changed the course of history. Because largely you can look at the UFO stuff happening, it was since the Nazis, that kind of went wrong, so that it came out and really exploded for the 50s. And the JFK assassination was like the icing on the fucking cake. It's like, boom. And then since that point, something went dark and something changed the course of how we lead the world, act, how we keep secrets and all that stuff. Like that to me is absolutely fucking fascinating. Like if you were to draw a map of how everything, it's like it started with the Nazis somehow, we really paid attention, but then that kind of didn't really work. So then it popped up over here. And then this major event in 63 just was like the ignition point for where we are today. Is that how you think too, Peter?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's what got me into the subject. It was because of that I wrote basically Sinister Forces from the point of view of there's this UFO component to this whole story. I wasn't going there initially. I was writing Sinister Forces, but I'm researching the Kennedy assassination. I come across this stuff and I'm thinking, what the fuck is this? This doesn't make any sense.
That's like one thing, Jim, about the UFO things and with what Peter's been doing with God's Man of War is like, if mankind is not aware that there might be a different form of consciousness out there, there's competing forms of consciousness on our physical plane. If we're not aware, we're going to grab onto the wrong form. And that's the yin and the yang symbol of Earth, like at all times, it seems like that's why there needs to be a little bit of disclosure and conversation. And that's why I love that Peter was attacking the UAP subject with this occult, esoteric consciousness kind of angle. And that all leads into like politics and military industrial what we're doing. Like, this is what's happening because of all this other shit,
Well, we brought in, Kenneth Arnold and the Nazi stuff on the one side, but that's the other aspect. So you had the Maury Island affair with Fred Krisman. And then Fred Krisman turns out to be a witness in the Kennedy assassination investigation of Clay Shaw, right? And I mean,
why are these guys in all these same places?
That's why I got into it. I mean, I can't get it on board, right? And then there was, what's his name? The guy who ran the detective agency in New Orleans, right?
Oh, yeah.
So he has the detective agency, but he was working with the FBI originally in 1947, reporting on UFO phenomenon, going back, Guy Bannister. And he's sending all these telexes back to Hoover, directly to Hoover. Oh, I talked to this guy about this UFO thing. I talk about that UFO. There was a sighting over here. So he's researching UFO stuff in the same area as Kenneth Arnold, Maury Island, all that stuff in the Pacific Northwest, right? And now he's in New Orleans. Lee Harvey Oswald's hanging out in his office, right? Fred Krisman is now a suspect, so at least according to Jim Garrison. I mean, all these UFO guys show up, right? I mean, what the hell are they all doing there?
I'll tell you, I got a model here, and I am fucking convinced the Nazis were bridging these occult paranormal forces that we didn't know how to measure with scientific tools, but they bridged that with the science they had. It all went wrong. Some of them escaped. They fucking kept doing it. We grabbed onto them. and we brought them in. Kennedy was just like, we can't be doing this. We need to tell everyone about this. They clipped Kennedy because a lot of people wanted him dead anyways. And then they secreted it away. And then that little fucking fire smoldered and burned over decades in the wrong direction. In some ways, probably for good reason. In some other ways, it's convoluted. Who knows? But I have a feeling it's all tied to this. Like, that's why you're fighting these threads. That's why there's people that were on the ground with Kenneth Arnold that coined the term flying saucers. Why are those guys at the Kennedy assassination? You know, why are those people channeling alien forces housing Lee Harvey Oswald? You know, it's like you're finding all these threads because it's all connected to, like, we got a hold of something and we got to shut it down. Kennedy's like, bring it out. We're like, shut him down. You know, like, I have a feeling that's the real true history of the free world, unfortunately.
And it's probably not a conspiracy in the sense that we like to think of it. This is something that's bigger, deeper, more profound than just a political conspiracy, because this goes over decades and decades, right? So we're not talking about a bunch of guys, once again, in the back room smoking cigars saying, we need, Arnold over here. We need, Guy Bannister over there with the UFOs. It's not happening that way. It's happening organically somehow. But it's still a phenomenon that we just can't understand until we start understanding more about our reality and how it works. The whole idea of synchronicity, how does that really work? What does that work here? The sinister forces that I write about, right? There's something darker at work underneath all of this. And it's not just a bunch of guys doing this on their own. This is something else.
Well, we're talking again about, what DeLonge calls the control mechanism. Is there some kind of control mechanism that's working throughout history? I have a couple more questions before we end this, and I want to get to those really quickly. Peter, towards the end of the book, you discuss a document that was a result of a symposium that was held at the United States Air Force Academy in May of 1969. You state that it provides us a revealing look into the military and bureaucratic mindset. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? I'm not sure what we're talking about here, but go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually quite delicious. I mean, from my perspective, I came across this document. It's called Science, Technology, and the Military, I believe is the name of the document, published by the U.S. government, by the Department of Defense. It's a record of symposia that were held in 1969 and 1970. And it gives you this look into what's going on with, the military-industrial complex and how they're having a really hard time trying to incorporate the scientists with the military types. The military types don't like the scientists. They want the scientists to stay away from their thing. We're the military guys. We like to blow shit up. Leave us alone. Don't give us all this other technology stuff and start getting us involved in weird, arrangements of data and all this other. We don't like this. We want to march. We have guns and we're good. Leave us alone. We want World War II. Right? So just, leave us alone. But there was this major emphasis, probably started because of von Karman and his military-industrial complex fascination that he wanted to do what Germany had done. And you had to, incorporate science and technology into the military. If you read it, it's a bitchy, chatty kind of document where they're talking about people basically insulting each other and saying, no, we don't want to do this shit. We don't like that. We don't want to do this. We don't want these, for want of a better term, these nerds getting involved in our business. And it shows you the emotional resistance to this kind of thinking. We don't want to think outside the box. You stay in your box and you leave us alone. And if you read through this stuff, it's fascinating because I did a lot of research in World War II, obviously, and there was a great book. It was title I forget at the moment, but it was about the British government and their difficulty in trying to incorporate science and technology into their, defense against Nazi Germany. And there were scientists saying, you got to understand, Einstein, the bomb, all this other stuff is going on. They got these missiles. They're all doing all these other things. And the British were like resisting it. No, don't tell us about that. We don't believe any of that stuff. Just stay over there in your lane, biological, chemical war, all this other stuff, the radar situation with the Nazis were developing. All of this, and the military was resistant to it. There was an Office of Scientific Research, and they were just put aside in a part of the building, just don't bother us, right? And they're coming out with this stuff, and they're trying to convince the British, their own people, this is how you defend yourself against this. And it's just too weird to them. They didn't want to deal with it. And this document shows the American military going through exactly the same thing in the 1960s, as late as the 1960s. Vietnam is at full swing, right? you got the Phoenix program where they're screwing with people's minds, right? They're trying to use mind control things and, a propaganda, weird, vampires and all kinds of stuff to scare the population, trying to use stuff like that to soften using cyborg techniques. And they're still resisting the military to go deeper into this to see how this works. And I find that document, you can find it online. It's very easy. Just Google science, technology in the military, and you'll come right up with it. It's a PDF. You can download it. It makes for very amusing reading, but it's an official document. And I find it shows you even then, even after the bomb, even after everything we went through, even after at that time, CIA was very still involved in behavior modification and all that so-called mind control stuff. They were still resisting it. They still didn't want to know. They still wanted the scientists to stay out of their business. And there was this fight between them. How do we organize? We have to reorganize the military around this. God forbid you reorganize the military around this. Right. You stay the same way. We don't want an Office of Scientific Research and Development. Or if we do, it's going to be in the basement, and this kind of reaction against it. And if you look at that and you look at where we are now with the UFO phenomenon, you can easily imagine the amount of resistance there would be, psychological resistance against taking this seriously. Either we don't want to take it seriously, we don't want to deal with it, or for religious reasons, we're talking about demons and, stuff we're not supposed to know about. Who was it who said, you're not supposed to know about this until you die? The guy who took on Alexander, right? This is the problem we have. This is why we can't get closer. There's just so much, I think, subconscious or conscious psychological resistance against it. And if you read this document, you can't believe they're talking about this in the 1960s, as late as 1970. We don't want this. We don't want to integrate this stuff with us at all, right? So how are you going to deal with the UFO phenomenon? How?
Yeah, which, leads me to, because we're running out of time here, but my last question, and I'll throw this out to both of you. Do you think we will ever solve the mystery of the phenomenon? I mean, do you have any hopes at all that this might occur our lifetime obviously Tom's lifetime is going to be longer than ours, but what do you think?
Gosh, I think, I don't know if it's kind of like saying, are we going to understand the universe? I think if the universe is truly infinite, then there's infinite possibility. But the one thing that always blows my mind is they say on a quantum level, if time is parallel and not linear, everything in the past, present, and future is happening simultaneously. Yeah, that still creates infinite possibility. So that means there can't really be an end to what the universe is offering us. I mean, like that, I hit up Peter not too long ago that I really am. Peter, I think it's time for you to take a fucking deep dive into just the cryptid creatures that we've seen for thousands of years in all continents, all Native American type indigenous tribes, all the legends, mythologies, and folklore. I mean, it's always been there, right? And this is either attached to or separate from the UAP phenomenon. Who knows? But even that is like a whole nother can of worms and rabbit hole for Peter to dig into. We probably won't see him for like 5 years. He'll pop out with all his knowledge. But there's so much out there. So will we fully understand it? I don't know. When we see these gray aliens with the big eyes, are these clones that were created by their makers to do tasks, but then the makers died and these things just went on? Or are these clones created by insects and plant life that went rapidly evolved for 100 billion years, left untouched? They were insects one day, but then we came back 100 billion years later, and like that cricket, that praying mantis grew. It's not just building like a beehive. Now it's building craft. What are these things? And what all their, or is it all of the above? Someone made a clone and they died and the clone went on for 100 billion years. There was an insect on the lonely planet and that insect went crazy for 100 billion years. I think there's a lot of things that are happening. And I've said it on a different podcast of ours. If you're in the ocean and you see a dolphin swim by, you're like, okay, there's dolphins here. And then you see a jellyfish. Okay, there's jellyfish and dolphins. Then you see a Coke can float by. And then you find a boat and the Coke can fell off the boat. But then you figure out that the boat came from an island that you never even knew existed. It keeps going and going, but there's still dolphins and jellyfish. So I think there's always going to be a lot more to understand. And I think that the things that are fucking around with us are kind of all the above. So I think one problem that we have as human beings is we tend to describe everything finitely. Is that a word? That's a word, right? Okay. We describe everything into what we know. Like we see a craft with an alien on it, and we're like, that comes from another planet. Until we learn that it's kind of jumping around with frequency. And then we go, well, maybe it's coming from time, and you're like, oh, it's like the goalpost is always going to move. And I don't think there's one answer for all the things that are going on here. And I think that's the problem, is we see this one big shiny object and we're trying to just describe that. But then these people are meeting with these 9 forces of nature back in the 60s. And you're like, well, what's that? Is that, well, I don't know. That might be something different, So I think we're probably trying to describe a lot of things potentially. And that's why it's not making much sense, but I don't know.
Yeah. Peter, you have anything you want to add?
Tom pretty much said everything I was going to say. All I would add to that is these things, whatever the phenomenon is, it could land on the White House lawn. It could land in Washington, D.C., like Klaatu, and Gort, and we still wouldn't know what the hell it was. We would still look at it and say, well, what is it? How do we describe it? Where does it fit in? We would still be sitting there thinking, we still don't know what this is. They could land, look at it, say hi, take off, and there'll be 10 different, explanations for it. We'd have 10 different, scientists and military people, intelligence people telling us what we saw, and we're going to sit there and still not know. I think we need a different kind of understanding of how knowledge works, of how reality works. I've got this thing coming up in February, as a matter of fact, in Joshua Tree. They conned me into it, a bunch of people, to talk about celestial ascent. The ancient peoples, how they viewed this type of process, that there's a way of like climbing the ladder, of climbing up the chariot, to go to the 7 heavens, to pass through various stages of that. And it's kind of a non-human intelligence, kind of a CE5 kind of thing, but it's really based upon the ancient texts. So we're going to try to do this, try to explore it with, lectures and things, and try to see, as well as with some practices, to see what the ancients were talking about. What does this really mean? Celestial ascent. Is that going to get us a little closer to understanding what we're dealing with the phenomenon? So that's something that we're involved in, trying to find different ways of approaching this problem. And sometimes you got to do it without books, do it through direct experience if you can, or at least to talk to other people who've had experiences and try to understand what they're saying. Judge truth or falsehood or reality based upon your interaction with them, right? Come away with the feeling that this person's telling the truth, but what is that truth and what does it really mean? That is sometimes even more useful than reading a book. Not more useful than reading Sekret Machines War, mind you.
Yeah, right.
But also useful.
I got something I want to throw at both of you guys. The reason I hold more weight with some of these ancients and the indigenous and Native American tribes, or, any native tribes, is very simple. The neuroplasticity in our brains, our neurons grow within minutes of whatever we choose to focus our attention on. And if you're watching CNN, at the 15-minute mark, you will start growing neurons to receive CNN. I mean, but a Native American or an indigenous tribe, some dude living in the fucking forest without an iPhone, is tuned into nature. If you're walking through a forest and it's a real threat that a mountain lion is going to fucking jump out and eat you at all times, I guarantee you, your hearing and your eyes and your senses are just super in tune as you walk through that forest, quiet, like a deer. And that's the difference. And that's why when they wrote shit down and carved it on a rock, it's because they saw it all happening. They see the orbs of light. They see things popping out of the sky. They see a Bigfoot run through the campsite and there's footprints on the ground. They just feel the vibration differently. If you're blind, your hearing gets better and you start to sense, your senses grow in all directions. But our senses we're not even looking up. We're in traffic. We're on a computer screen. We're not tuned into nature at all. And if that double slit experiment is true, where you determine taking something from a wave of light, of probability, of consciousness, and your observation turns it into a particle, into a wave, a light particle, into a physical particle. It takes an observer, a human being, to antenna that force into physical reality. Then it makes a hell of a lot of sense that us as antennas collectively together are making reality into something. We are turning things into aliens, into trolls, into leprechauns, into whatever over time as mass conscious. That's why, they get together and Native Americans can make it rain, because they're all meditating together and they're focusing on it. I said this on a different podcast. I think I did. 1 year to the date after 9/11. On 9/11, the first annual fucking of 9/11, guess what the three numbers were in the state lottery for New York? I watched it on the news. 911. Three balls and the spinning balls that pop up. Why? Because everyone's thinking about 9/11. The mass consciousness made those the lottery numbers. And I think we got to pay attention to that. So whatever we all think is going to happen. And I'm wondering if there's a force of nature getting us to focus on phones and feed our fears and group together and make things happen. So we slowly devolve our species in one direction versus evolving one way into something more harmonious and beautiful with nature, more aware of how it works. I'm out. I'm dropping the microphone right there.
I loved it. I loved it. Hey, listen, guys, thank you so much. Tom, what's next for you? Where are you going? When are you going on tour again?
We have so much cool shit happening. We just dropped a couple books. We dropped Trilogy. I'm holding in my hand. You can't see it for the podcasters. AJ, that wrote Sekret Machines, came out with this book. There's some really great stuff in this book, Trilogy. We didn't write it for no reason. We didn't write it just because it's just a cool story. There's an event in this book that I had a conversation with somebody on that I think people should read and understand. Then we came out with War, the third one, in God's Man and War. We're talking about it on this entire podcast, which is it's a scholarly textbook that's going to change your life if you have time to dig into it. So, which by the way, on Amazon is 5 stars by all the reviews. So I just think Peter did such a great job. I got a movie that we're planning out to shoot next year. We just sold a few more things, a couple more series that we haven't been able to announce yet, but we will be announcing soon. So to the stars, as far as the film world goes and the projects we're creating, we are flying, we are soaring. These things do take time in the sense of, you put it together, you develop it, then you pitch it, then you have to do contracts, and then you got to write the scripts, then you got to get it greenlit, then you got to attach directors and that, so it takes time, but it is going so fucking well. So I'm super, super excited. To the Stars is killing it. Now I just got to get off tour. I got 6 more shows. We pulled 120 shows. I'm exhausted. But now for the next couple of years, we're making movies. We're making TV shows. We got cool shit happening. So still.
Right. I love it. I love it. I love it. Our time together today is sadly coming to a close, and we are going to have to wrap this session of TTS Talks. Tom, Peter, thank you again for spending time with us today. And I hope we can chat again with both of you soon. A special thanks to our producers, AC Catrone, Carrie DeLonge, and Lisa Clifford for all their help and guidance, and without whom this podcast would not be possible. All of the Sekret Machines books are available at tothestars.media. You can stay up to date with TTS by finding us on social media. Instagram at tothestars.media, Twitter at tothestarsmedia, and Facebook at To The Stars Inc. Again, thanks for tuning into TTS Talks. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast, rate and review us over at Apple Podcast, and we will catch you next time for another TTS Talks.